This afternoon, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Michael Cambell as he shares on Dakota Adventist history. Dr. Cambell serves as Director of the North American Division Department of Archives, Statistics, and Research, and has spent many years studying and teaching church history. Along with his academic work, he has also helped develop several Pathfinder honors, including honors on women in Adventist history and the great controversy in the history of the Sabbath. We look forward to the stories and insights he will share with us today. Let's have prayer. Dear Jesus, thank you so much for this opportunity for us to come together and learn more about our history and where we've come from and how far we've come. We just ask that your Spirit will be with Dr. Cambell as he shares with us today. Amen.
All right, thank you so much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Glad to be here with you. You are the faithful, the remnant after lunch. That is always the biggest challenge, whether it's at camp meeting or teaching a class, and so I'm excited to be able to be here with you. It's been just an absolutely delightful time. I've been looking forward to being up here on the plains of Dakota, and so just to be able to see so much incredible beauty has been wonderful. My special breakaway was when I first got here on Thursday afternoon, getting over to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. I mean, just to get to see a national park, and what a wonder, what a jewel that is. And so you just have so much beauty here up in the Dakotas. I've been absolutely enchanted. The other thing that's been really fun is to, of course, make reacquaintances with quite a number of you, and everything else I've been studying for some time, knowing that I'd be coming here for camp meeting, a little bit of the history of Adventism here in the Dakotas as well. Now, my presentation this afternoon is not the definitive final word on all of these things. I've been doing some research, a number of articles and books, primary sources, a couple places where I disagree with some other people who've been writing about this. That's not to say that anybody that does research, you're going to, and probably be some people that pick some bones with some of my interpretations, some of the things that I found as well. But I'm going to share with you some stories, some of the things that I found interesting as I've been doing research along the way about the history of Adventism here. So, beautiful picture. And before I knew the theme for the conference, but this morning's sermon from Pastor Bradshaw, that quotation from Ellen White, Life Sketches, page 196, that we have nothing to fear for the future except as we forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past. And so part of the reason that we're gathered here together at camp meeting, we're remembering the biblical impetus, our reason why we're here, where we're going in terms of Bible prophecy, God's call, Jesus' soon return, but we're also remembering the sacrifice and commitment of those early Adventist pioneers who came up here. And I'll tell you, even today, I was having some debates with some of my Adventist historian friends, like, hey, I'm checking on a couple of these facts and some really interesting, again, characters and stories of the early beginnings. Well, I'll tell you just a fun story. I've been here with you the last couple of days, enjoyed getting to know each of you a little bit better. I like to tell kind of a fun story just about myself and my own story. And when I was starting to get a little bit more serious with the young lady that I was dating in college, and you know that's why we have Adventist colleges, don't you? And so I remember I was at the General Conference at the cafeteria as an intern at the White Estate, and good old Elder C.D. Brooks, he came and sat with a group of us interns, and he came to me one day and said, Michael, you have a girlfriend, right? And he knew I was a theology student. I said, No, sir. No, I don't. I didn't want to get into all the details. I'd broken up. This is kind of not the best moment to be asking that question, but I remember he prayed for me, and he it's just a beautiful prayer. And that next year, I did meet this young lady in the cafeteria at the school where I was going. She was in one of the cashiers, and so I checked out in her line, and sometimes I think she's still taking my money, but that's okay, But as things were getting a little bit more serious, I knew she really enjoyed, she was an English and history major, so she really enjoyed plays, historical plays, things like that. So I knew I wanted to take her down to a nearby city, and had saved up my shekels to take her to this one place. Now, this is so long ago, so historical. I know this is going to be difficult for some of you to appreciate, but this is so long ago. This is before they had directions on cell phones. Some of you are nodding your heads. You know what I'm talking about. With a thing called MapQuest or whatever, you'd print out those directions. So we were down in Atlanta, and the directions said to turn on Peachtree Street. The thing I discovered about being in Atlanta is there are a lot of... That's right. Maybe you've been there too. And the thing of it is I had no idea which Peachtree Street I was on anymore. You ever been just so completely, totally lost? Now, I had spent this money on these tickets, and I knew if I was late, I was going to miss this special moment, this special date, and everything else that I've been working for and planning so hard. And sometimes when the pressure is on, you make some mistakes, things that you weren't expecting. And so I pretty soon I turned on a street, and then I realized I was driving the wrong way down a one-way street. And so, and then sometimes you make one mistake, and then you make another mistake trying to fix that mistake. And so before I knew it, I turned again on another street thinking, oh, there's some cars at the end, and that's a wrong way down another one-way street too, but thankfully there were no cars. And I got to the end of that street, and I thought the coast was clear. I was going to be in the good. I could stop and ask for directions, and I met one of Atlanta's finest. I didn't even try to get away. I just pulled over to the side, and this very tall officer walked up to me, said, "Son, what are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, officer, I'm so sorry. I'm lost." He said, "I can see that." He said, "What are He said, "Do you have any tickets? Anything I need to know about?" And I said, "Oh no, officer." And he said, "I'll be the judge of that." And so he took my registration, license, all of that stuff. And before I knew it, it seemed like an eternity. He came back to the window and he said to me, "Well, she made you do it, didn't she?" And I said, "Oh, officer, you do want to get me in trouble, don't you? And I'm so sorry." I was just very repentant there, and he said, "Where are you going?" I told him to such and such a place, and we're probably not going to make it because we're just lost. And he said, "I think you need a police escort." And so he gave us a police escort straight to the theater. And would you believe it? We made it there just in the nick of time. So God is good. And last thing before I wrap up this camp meeting here with you guys is I also like to make sure. I've noticed that you have long stretches of highway. Some of you drive, and sometimes it could be a little bit getting between one place and another. So I want to make sure you know about some of the best resources we've been creating at the North American Division, and including podcasts. These are free stories and research, and we're just producing. There's a whole cadre of several of us younger historians that have been kind of collaborating together, having fun, encouraging each other. So the Adventist History Podcast, if you haven't checked that out, Matthew Lucio, a good friend of mine, he puts that together, has been working on that for the last decade, and he just really makes Adventist history come alive, and fun stories and anecdotes. We've got the Ellen White podcast. I've been working on getting that going again. We've got the Adventist Pilgrimage podcast, a couple of my other historian friends. And of course, I'm a little bit biased, just a little bit biased, but maybe my favorite podcast is the one my wife, who's also a historian, is that she's been putting together on the contributions, the stories of women in Adventist history. And the first book ever written about women in Adventist history, these stories, was titled "They Also Served." So I just gave you a little sneak preview of where the name of the podcast at least comes from. So check that out. These are free resources wherever you like to listen to podcasts online, Apple there's a whole bunch of them, but check them out, and those are great resources. The other thing I like to share with people is some people have been asking me in the cafeteria and stuff like that, "Hey, you work at the North American Division, what's that like?" And I never thought I'd ever work at the North American Division, but I want to tell you that we've got great church leaders. Elder Alexander Bryan, our division president, Elder Kyoshin On, our executive secretary, Judy Glass, who's now our division treasurer, our first woman as a officer of the North American Division. Pretty cool. But this is one of our leadership councils, and Reddy Robinson was back with us, and Elder Bryant was going out to do some evangelistic meetings, and we just all gathered around our leaders, and so this wasn't a posed shot or anything. This is just me stopping in the middle of prayer, getting my cell phone out, grabbing a quick snapshot. And what I love is to see we have praying church leaders. I know our church isn't perfect. perfect, but I can tell you we've got leaders who care deeply about the church, its mission, and want to see all of our churches, at all levels of our church, we're here to advance the mission of Jesus. And I just wanted you to see kind of a glimpse behind the scenes of some of our church leaders. So, and one last thing, and then I'm going to get into Dakota Adventist history, but in case some of you are going to challenge me and say, hey, I don't know, where's some of your information coming from, is we have a really cool online encyclopedia called the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventism. Group of historians. We've got actually hundreds of contributors from around the world church, and it's online. Again, it's free, encyclopedia.adventist.org. I put this in my presentation because there's a great article on the history of the Dakota Conference. And so if you're looking for research and materials, whatever it might be, and I've heard a lot of different topics, a lot of different questions, I like people to know what are the resources our church is trying to put together to be available to try to assist those of you who want to learn more. And so those are the kinds of cool things that are up there and on the way. Now, this is the earliest camp meeting photograph I could find in the archives of a Dakota Adventist camp meeting. I don't have anything to the very earliest beginnings of Adventism, but I do have at least this picture from the early 1920s. I thought you'd like to see this because I want you to get in the spirit of camp meeting, which means that I think sometimes you all get too comfortable in those lovely cushioned chairs. The early days of camp meetings would have been on those rough-hewn boards. And they said it wasn't a good camp meeting unless you had several splinters in your derriere. So just imagine, how good that all of you have it. And of course, that's 1920s. You can see those Model Ts and all of those other fun vehicles, all the tents. And camp meeting has always been an adventure. It's been something that's been at the heartbeat of Adventism. It's almost as Haystacks actually is kind of Adventist too, but that's not even as old as camp meeting. Camp meeting goes back even farther. Haystacks only goes back to like World War II, the early 1940s. But camp meetings all the way back to the beginnings of Adventism here in the Dakotas. People wanted to get together for a variety of different reasons, partly to get together to worship, to encourage one another. Sometimes as an evangelistic focus, people would come, invite their friends, and just like Elder Bradshaw this morning at the end of his sermon had an altar call, inviting people to come and know Jesus. And that's at the heartbeat of camp meetings. And so I just want you to kind of to reminisce in that kind of spirit of the early beginnings of Adventism in the Dakotas. Well, the earliest reference I've been able to find to the Dakotas is not anybody trying to go to the Dakotas, but it is in a population schedule looking at the population of the United States. It was reprinted actually there's two early things. There's this population schedule, and then there is a report of the Indian Wars, there is unrest, and of course, about some of those things. There's a couple of these national parks out here with all the way into Montana, some of the strife and unrest that was going on. Now, there was an interesting little commentary that some of the oppressive measures and laws and things that had been done to them were inciting all of these kinds of things. So at least our church leaders, I think they recognized some of the problems that were contributing to the unrest and those kinds of things. But you also have the population of the United States, which in 1870, that's the 1870 U.S. Census, was about 38 million. I'm looking at my slide up there, but I'm at the point in my life where I'm having to have bifocals, so I have to go back to all my slides and make all the print a little bit bigger. So help me out if I don't get my facts right. I'm not infallible here, but you can notice that on Dakota there's only a population of 14,000 as opposed to the previous census in 1860 of just under 5,000. So you can see that the Dakotas were part of this westward expansion across the country, and with that westward expansion, as populations were shifting, that we'd begin to very quickly see the beginnings, the birth of Adventism. Adventists would move westward right along with these other larger migratory shifts. Now, who were these early immigrants who were migrating to the Dakotas? Anybody know? Any guesses? You have some Germans, but even more than the Germans, where were most of the earliest immigrants to the Dakotas from? Scandinavia. All right. I have two last pairs of socks, but I don't know who. I'm going to have to make a harder question. Did you? All right. One of these will be for you, okay, afterwards. And I'll have a second question before I'm done, okay? So you come up and find me. I don't dare throw them because I'm going to take somebody out. I know. Yeah, so from immigrants from Scandinavia, from Denmark, from Sweden, from Norway, those are the largest groups of immigrants that were coming here to the Dakotas, which is very interesting because that meant that of those waves of immigration that you had pockets and groups of people with these different language groups, including Germans and several others, that began to populate in certain population centers and little densities where you'd have, and so that created a little bit of interesting dynamics of, because how do you share your faith if you can't speak the language? And so at the very earliest beginnings of the Dakotas is this need to share one's faith, but how to produce materials that would be readable, would be understandable to people. And so this would actually be how the early beginnings of Adventism would begin. Now, just as a precursor, I was talking yesterday a little bit about the beginnings of early Adventism with William Miller. We had people like Joseph Wolf who went through Europe, who went through North Africa. And in Scandinavia, there were the child preachers. And Ellen White talks about this in the book, The Great Controversy, how there were these child preachers when the adults were forbidden from sharing their faith, that these children literally, the ropaire is what they were called, would rise up and begin to proclaim. And historians who talk and look at this time period say it's just kind of this uncanny, unexplainable historical phenomena that happened. You had all these children interested in religion and in Bible prophecy and that were proclaiming the news of Jesus and his soon return. Now, this is interesting and connects to the Dakotas because in those Scandinavian countries where those child preachers were, you have a huge outflux of immigrants that then come westward, including here to the Dakotas. So some of those early children and those people interested in the Bible and Bible prophecy found that it was now possible, as they became immigrants looking to start their lives anew, to have the freedom. And so some of the early histories talk about how this prepared the way for many of these early immigrants to be interested in Bible prophecy and so on. Now, the earliest evidence we have, now check this out. I'm just sharing with you what I find in the archives here, okay? So I've been kind of unraveling this little mystery, so you're going to help me out here this afternoon. So I just did a screenshot from one of these digital resources, and so we have the earliest, I'm going to contend here. Now, some people may disagree with me, but based on the best research I can do, the earliest research of an Adventist, somebody who believes in Jesus and then keeping the Sabbath and so on, is the earliest evidence we have of Adventism coming to the Dakotas is in this obituary, okay? And it says here simply, died near Springfield, and I hope I'm saying this correct. Forgive me, I'm not up on all the how to pronounce these things, but the Bonham County, anyways, in Dakota, that's in South Dakota, December 23, 1873, Sarah, wife of S.C. Conry, age 38 years. And so, and this is published in the Review and Herald. It says she left behind a husband and 8 children, so a very traumatic, terrible thing that was going on. And by the way, I did a little bit of research. I'll share with you some more about this. She had just had childbirth, and so we know a little bit more because both she and the child died within quick succession of each other, as well as one of the other children also died soon after that. So I'm not sure. It doesn't say whether it was typhoid or tuberculosis, but probably something like that is my guess. Anyway, so we have an obituary. We have some kind of clue. And that's part of what historians do, is we take clues and we try to piece them together the best we can. So you're with me on this, okay? So I did some genealogical research to try to figure out, can I figure out who this person was, and create a little bit of a genealogical tree, and started using Find a Grave. And guess what? I found that we have here in South Dakota the actual graves of who I believe are the very first Adventist family here on the Dakota Plains. And here's pictures of that cemetery of each of their graves. Now, we don't know much about them because most of the family quickly died after that, and it's kind of a sad, tragic story. But the best I can tell, most likely as they were migrating westward, that we have other later descriptions that the earliest Adventists who came here to the Dakotas had been exposed to some literature, some Adventist literature. Now, we might think of the Review and Herald or Signs of the Times, but the best I can tell, the Adventiende, which is the Danish periodical, the first Adventist publication in any other kind of non-English language. And so again, Danish and Norwegian and Swedish immigrants, they're close enough, at least I'm told, that sometimes they can usually understand most or translate. It's close enough, especially between the Norwegian and the Danish, I'm told. So, and then from there we find a description shortly thereafter, and here's what it says. I'm going to read it off my screen, a little easier for me here. It says, good fruits. And it says simply this: a brother from Elk Point, Dakota Territory. So before this is even either of these places are states, he says, I was persuaded last summer by an Adventist sister to read the review. So this is, again, Adventist literature spreading across the plains, excuse me. It says, I found them stored with such sound scriptural doctrine and based upon such plain and substantial arguments that after a careful study of the scriptures on the subjects during the past winter, and I know you have long winters here, I have concluded to accept the truth, or as some of my neighbors call it, the strange doctrine. How do you like that? The strange doctrine. There is no church or class of Adventists in this country, none who keep the Sabbath of the Lord, but the sister above referred to and her family. So again, early evidence of these immigrants making their way along with literature that is beginning to spread. And this becomes even more significant soon later because we see that within a very short amount of time, there begins to be several of these groups. So tracking which one is the first. Now, I'm making the case of the person I just showed you is the earliest of the small groups, but within about an 18-month period, there's several of these groups. We see this in a report by S.N. Haskell. This is a missionary report. S.N. Haskell is one of the great missionaries in the history of our denomination. Now, he would travel around the world scouting out potential mission sites, all of those kinds of things. But he was also very concerned about mission work here at home, as he would have said back then, that making sure that we're not missing out or losing out on any of these kinds of opportunities. And so he describes how there are these silent messengers. That was a phrase that they like to use. You know, they sometimes, Ellen White liked to call it the leaves of autumn. So these silent messengers, these tracts and pamphlets. And he describes there are individuals in small companies observing the Sabbath. So people being convicted as they're studying these kinds of truths here, right? And he says, in Dakota, we have learned of 3 small companies, the least numbering 6, now observing the Bible Sabbath, which have never heard a sermon nor seen the face of a person of like faith except of their own number. So again, tracing the exact lineage is very difficult. I'm making the case of one of those families that we can tell for sure. But yeah, within about an 18-month span, here we have these different groups. So we're seeing Adventism is quickly catching on. Now, what I find is very interesting is this next slide. I wish I had a picture of him. I can't even tell for certain when he was born and when he died, except for that he was just like everywhere. He was in Minnesota. It's like he knew the Mid-America Union before there was a Mid-America Union. It's like all the states in Mid-America, and so you have Minnesota and Iowa, and he's just everywhere, and I can hardly pin him down as to try to get a good sense. And I can't find an obituary, and I don't know why, if it wasn't because nobody just never wrote an obituary, but he was very significant. And as far as I can tell, until he did die, and I have a rough range of when I think that might have taken place, he was just a faithful servant of the Lord who just loved to share Jesus. The clue that I have, and maybe one of you will help me figure out the rest of this story, this mystery. In fact, the very best genealogist I know of in the country is a very good friend of mine, and I said, I've spent several hours I spent 2 more hours last night before this is what I like to do for fun. And I was just trying to see, could I track this down? And so I put the best genealogist I know of on the case. She said, I'm struggling on this one, okay? So we're still trying to, it's a little bit of an enigma, but we know his name at least was John Hansen. So I'll tell you what I do know about him. I know he was born in Denmark. He immigrated to the States at some point, most likely probably in the early 1850s, maybe 1860s, and he was converted when he met another early Adventist Danish preacher by the name of John Madison. Now, he was a Baptist, and when he heard the truth, he accepted it, readily embraced it, became kind of his ministerial intern, started traveling around doing evangelism, and in a very short amount of time, he is going off on his own. And his first mission itinerary was to come into northern Iowa and before then, borders were a little bit more fluid. And he just said, well, there's people interested in the truth up on the Dakota Plains. And so he just goes right on up there. And so as far as I can tell, I think he's the first Adventist minister to do any kind of real work for the Lord here and for advancing the Adventist cause here, again, in the Dakotas. So, and he will actually go up to... he will go up to Swan Lake. Anybody know Swan Lake? Anybody from Swan Lake? Maybe, but you know where Swan Lake is. Okay. And today I understand, doing the more work on this, that the descendants of this group of believers is now part of the Hurley Seventh-day Adventist Church. Anybody from the Hurley Church, just by chance? Just curious, maybe? Anyways, I was curious because I would love to talk with you because this is very interesting to me. And so he goes up and visits, and he'll do that in 1873, 1874. He'll actually go back to Minnesota. He's ordained at the Minnesota Campmeeting. And then when he returns back to South Dakota, to Swan Lake, he had left some literature, and he'll actually hold some meetings, and he will organize the very first Seventh-day Adventist church in the Dakotas. And so that's at Swan Lake. And so any of your friends, if you know anybody from the Hurley Church, tell them, hey, that you're part of that historical legacy of the birth of Adventism here in the Dakotas. Now, this will be kind of a complex, it's an interesting story as immigration and these different patterns take place. So I'll tell you some more interesting facets of how all of this takes place. And it's in a sod house, the sod house of Nels P. Nelson, that they organized the very first Seventh-day Adventist church. Now, I know something about sod houses because on the eastern plains of what is now North Dakota, my wife's great-great-grandparents came as early Scandinavian immigrants as well. And on one of our family trips, we went out to Fargo, and we actually went to the farm and found what was left of that sod house. So I know what those sod houses were like, those early farmers and immigrants. Man, that was challenging. It was difficult to be able to experience and kind of eke out a living and stake out their claim of land to try to be able to do those things. So life was hard. And between John Hansen, Pastor Hansen's first and second visit, the church members there in Swan Lake had what they called a grasshopper epidemic that, and I quote, completely destroyed their crops. And so you can imagine that went through great suffering at that time, and even lack of food to be able to and of course, some of their friends are going to say, oh, look, you're becoming an Adventist. God's punishing you, right? Or it could be that God is testing their faith. And so here you have this with Hansen and everything. So the birth of Adventism, it takes a kind of an initial foothold here in the Dakota Plains, but there's more to the story. But first, I have to back up here just a little bit because I got to tell you a little bit more about the story behind the story. Because how did Adventism begin to become multicultural, become multi-ethnic, to begin to realize that Adventism couldn't just remain in one place, that God was calling this as a movement to every nation, tongue, tribe, and people, that meant that they had a work to do. Well, think about it. What's happening at that time in the early 1870s? Who's our first official missionary? Jane Andrews. Some of you are hesitating because after yesterday, you're like, that was a trick question. We talked about Tchaikovsky, didn't we? Yeah, see, some of you were listening, I know. But yeah, Jane Andrews. And so missionaries were going to all kinds of different places, overseas to Europe, some even going to California. Some people still think California needs missionaries, but anyways. But John Madison is the first person that says it's not enough to only print materials in English. We need to translate them, and he's the one that's behind this whole Advent Tiende, the first Adventist periodical. And just recently, because I like old things, and so I'm always looking, and I had an old friend of mine that called me up and he said, Michael, I got some old books. And he said, I don't want them anymore. Would you like them? He said, well, I don't know what you have, but I never know, And so I was looking through, and one of them was this book that I took a picture of. It's probably my most recent cool thing in Adventist history archives that I've just discovered or found. And I didn't even know it existed. And as far as I can tell, I went online. I think there's only 4 copies of this book that are known to exist in the entire world. It's the first Adventist book published in another language, which is Danish. And you can see the title, and if you translate it, because I can use Google Translate as best as anyone else, it's a book about the state of the dead. And John Madison's sharing his views, writing them in Danish so that others will be convicted about the same biblical truths that he believes. Now, that's a picture of the young John Madison. Of course, he'll go back to Scandinavia. He'll do all kinds of interesting missionary work. And so he's a cool story. I mean, I could do a whole afternoon presentation just on John Madison. If you want to learn more, go to that Encyclopedia of Adventism I was just telling you about. Great resource for learning more about people like John Madison. But John Madison, he's the mentor, right, of John Hanson. So I just want you to kind of get a little bit of the clue, and maybe someday I'll find a picture of Pastor Hanson, who is the first Adventist pastor here and the first to organize a church in the Dakotas. Now, this is my little shameless advertisement for Adventist Archives. If some of you have old historical photographs, I would encourage you to consider thinking about placing them in an Adventist archive somewhere. We have a number of them at our different institutions. Of course, I know we have a Heritage Room collection at Union Adventist University, so I hope it's okay. It's a little shameless plug for Union here, but consider giving and donating those historical photographs or church records. If you have something like that, come talk to me. I would love to help connect you to make sure those things, don't throw them away. That's the thing that almost gives me a heart attack, is don't tell me those horror stories. Oh, we had a whole old box of pictures in the church and we just threw it. Don't say things like that. That gets me really worked up, okay? So, but if you know of those things, don't get rid of them. Talk to me. I would love to. Dr. Yami, my good friend there, she's nodding her head too. I mean, we can help make those connections, right? So we want those things preserved so that we can better tell those stories of Adventism here in your part of the world, how God led in the past here, literally here in the Dakota Plains. Well, I'm going to keep moving on because I want to tell you some more about Swan Lake and some of the other ways in which Adventism continued to grow. And of course, Adventist history, when you study Adventist history, it's never just this, they started and it was easy peasy, and then churches were organized, everything was hunky-dory after that. No, it kind of went in bursts where there were times where it grew, but sometimes there were setbacks, okay? And so we see and I have a couple of these stories that illustrate both of those kinds of trends in Adventist history. But Swan Lake, let's come back to that. September 12, 1875, and here's the actual screenshot of the periodical where it has the actual announcement. That's where Pastor Hanson comes back, and he says he arrives back in September 2, and he talks about organizing the church. And of course, a couple more articles talk about the Swan Lake group, how they elected church officers. They even established to give some money, set it aside. Initially, it was based on what was called systematic benevolence, or sometimes affectionately known as Sister Betsy, that you would pay your tithes and offerings based on how much land and crops that you owned, right? And they said, well, that's kind of a good idea, but it doesn't work so well during the midst of an economic recession. And so when we had it's a whole economic history of Adventism we could do, but that they decided, that's a good idea, it just doesn't really work for us. And so they kind of reinvent the wheel, study the Bible again. They said, tithes and offerings, that 10%, that makes a lot more sense. And so actually, in a short time, they start actually doing tithes. So the church forms right at that moment as the church is changing from the systematic benevolence to the tithing system. And the next report of their financial giving is that they gave $100. And so, which was really important because that early contributions were vital for evangelism and being able to spread and share their faith here across the Dakotas. So I want you to also get a sense of their commitment and their sacrifice. This was something very real for them. And it says that the Lord blessed their membership. By May 1876, their membership had grown to 32 members. And a year later, they began to lay plans for the very first church building, Seventh-day Adventist church building in the Dakotas. Now, I have not been able to find in the archives a picture of that building. Maybe one of you know where that is. If such a picture does exist, I would love to see it. I have not been able to track that down. Now, there is a picture when I drove out to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. There was a random little old historic church on the side of the road. So it looks so picturesque to me. I took a picture of it to imagine what maybe this early Swan Lake church might have looked like. So I don't want to deceive you in thinking that that's actually the Swan Lake church, but that is an old church on the side of the road near Theodore Roosevelt National Park. Anyways, but the church is growing and within a very short amount of time. Now, this is very interesting because South Dakota is initially part of the Iowa Conference. You all are a mission of Iowa. And later, and I'll talk some more about this, when North Dakota becomes a thing, because the railroad is what makes it a thing, about 10 years later after this church is organized, then suddenly there's a whole influx of immigration taking place in the northern Dakota Plains, which becomes North Dakota, and those pockets of immigrants and the Adventist message will very quickly emerge across the North Dakota portion of the plains as well. And so the church, again, continues to grow. We have the dimensions 20 by, 30 by 10 feet. And it was a small little church building, rustic little small church that kind of neat to imagine, and again, maybe somebody will be able to help me out with that. The next three churches after Swan Lake. Now, the Swan Lake Church was initially, it's described as Norwegian and Danish, so a little bit of cultural overlap. The next church after that was the Sunnydale Church, that's in Clay County, which was Danish, and then there was the Big Springs Church in Union County, which was Swedish. And so again, you see this Scandinavian immigration. This is very strong across the plains. In fact, by the way, they initially will realize that the Scandinavian influence is so significant across this Midwestern plains that they will actually organize a series of separate seminaries. So there was the Danish-Norwegian Seminary, which eventually would become the Hutchinson Seminary. Today we have an academy there, Maplewood Academy. I think I even saw a little booth for them here, right? There's a history behind that because as the first wave of immigrants, they weren't able to necessarily adapt and learn to speak English as well as their children and grandchildren would. And so there would be this whole process of that's taking place, a sociological, this whole process that's taking place. So I want you to grasp that. And they're realizing we have to do missionary work. If we're really serious about what we believe, we need to train young workers to be able to be effective in all these different languages. By the way, you do know what our largest Adventist college in 110 years ago was in North America. Our largest Adventist college was what? Union. You should know this. Yeah, in your back door. It was because this is, again, with all the waves of immigration, you have all the, and so this is where the largest population was. And so Union was, it is kind of one of our flagship institutions going back to the very beginnings of Adventism. And so, and part of what happened is those different seminaries for the different language groups would eventually converge together into Union College as well. So that's a long, complex story I won't get into all the details of, but it's kind of it's a fun part of it. Well, where did English work begin? Well, Elk Point. southeastern corner, just outside of Sioux Falls. So do we have any Sioux Falls Elk Point people here? I'm just kind of curious. I know it's on the other side of the conference, but just maybe. I know about Sioux Falls a little bit because my sister and her husband, he did his medical residency there, so we used to go out and visit them, and I discovered some interesting things at the end of my presentation about Sioux Falls, but a fun little surprise for you for a little bit later. But we had some people reading the Review and Herald, people sending subscriptions and passing out literature, and one of our early workers passing through said, wait, there's a bunch of people interested in the Adventist message who speak English. Who knew? We should probably have a church there, an English church. And so that would become our very first church. And then we have the birth of evangelism here in the Dakotas. Now, there will be a church member, I think it's A.W. Pond, anyways, writes, and he's one of the two people there in Elk Point or Sioux Falls that will say, hey, if you send a pastor, we would really appreciate it. We'd love to have some evangelistic meetings here, if you would. And so Robert M. Kilgore, now, if you know your Adventist history, Kilgore is the same one who's our first pioneer missionary to Texas in the American South. And so he'll go down south and helps to establish a school down there called Keene Industrial Academy. A couple friends that I know from, because we have Southwestern Adventist University today as a result of that visionary foresight of establishing a school. Well, Kilgore will go down there, and after he's done some missionary work down in Texas, he comes up here to the Dakotas with a young ministerial intern by the name of Eugene Farnsworth. Now, Farnsworth is really cool because if you know your Adventist history, Washington, New Hampshire, there was the first two early Sabbath-keeping Adventist brothers, William and Cyrus Farnsworth. This is the son. Now he had, William had 22 children, 2 wives, 22 children. By the way, Ellen White, that's the family she writes the counsel to. Not at the same time. Yes, thank you. Yes, not at the same time. We did not believe in polygamy. So, but successively, okay? But catch this. Ellen White writes a letter to William Farnsworth and says, God wanted us to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, but he didn't count on you to do it by yourself. And so kind of encouraging, a little bit of restraint. But this is one of his children, and he becomes actually a mighty preacher, would spend most of his life actually here in the Midwestern part of the country, conference president, several conferences. Anyways, he and Kilgore hold evangelistic meetings. They preach their heart out, and as a result, in 1877, we have the first English-speaking church that is organized in the Dakota Plains. And so kind of a neat little facet to the beginnings of Adventism. Someday I'm going to do a thing on the great beards of Adventism. I think Kilgore on the right there deserves the honorary award. Eugene Farnsworth is a little bit younger, and so he just stuck with the mustache, I guess. But it's fun to see the pictures of the people and imagine who they were as real people, as real individuals. They each had their unique characteristics and personalities and everything else. So Kilgore and Farnsworth are really important to the story of Adventism in the Dakotas. Now, this next person is the first conference president. He's the first minister, whereas we had a couple of early pastors that came through, held evangelistic meetings, organized a church, but he becomes the first Adventist minister to actually reside and live in the Dakotas on a permanent basis. And so I found his picture thanks to ChatGPT. It helped to sharpen and colorize it. So we did not have color photography in the 19th century, so that is a little bit of creative license there. I just want to give you a heads up in historical honesty and transparency here. But Seymour B. Whitney, and he has some interesting stories of his family immigrate westward, and it's a whole series of brothers. And they become Adventist ministers. Now, the one on the right of the two brothers, all three of including the brother in the previous picture who's important here, the Dakotas, he becomes the pioneer Adventist missionary in England. He'll actually go to visit and reinforce and help support Jane Andrews. So he's like, you might say he was our second official missionary to go over to Europe. Like he's kind of in that reinforcement wave of sending missionaries overseas. And most people know him in Adventist history for that. But maybe also the other two brothers who are not as well known in Adventist history deserve some some attention as well. So Seymour Whitney is the one that we're going to talk about. And he organizes a series of these debates that go on. Very interesting. He comes to one town, and they actually will, there's somebody that gets some literature, and he writes to Pastor Seymour, and he says, if you'll just come and hold some meetings, we'd really appreciate it, maybe in the schoolhouse or the church. Well, the other pastors in town are threatened by this, and so they're really upset. They try to drive him out of town, and they challenge him to a debate, but instead they hold and hog up all the time so that he doesn't have any time. They play all kinds of interesting tricks. And in fact, at one time, they even tell the church members, if you go to hear the Adventists preach, that is tantamount to sinning. And they said, wait a minute. We thought we could study our Bibles for ourselves. We're Protestants. That sounds very popish. Our pastor's becoming popish. And then the next stunt is they go into the church, and finally they have to intervene with the city, local town officials and say, wait a minute, that's not fair. They're not playing nice. You got to give the Adventist preacher a chance to preach. And so they try to play a trick, and they take all the lights in the church so that in the evening meeting is completely dark. But not to worry, Adventists have always been resourceful at finding lights, and they found their own lanterns, came back, and they held their evangelistic meeting, held a whole series of evangelistic meetings after that, and this would become another one of the early churches here in the Dakotas. So I like that because that spirit of persistence, that they're willing to really invest and sacrifice and do whatever it takes to share their convictions. Another early church was in Maple Grove. Now this is artistic depiction in the archives that I did find of the actual early Maple Grove church, where there was some meetings that was taking place. Similar kind of story where they try to stop them, but sometimes they say, you can't do anything against the truth, but only for the truth. And this is, again, where the opposition ended up becoming a catalyst for helping to advance what was going on here. The other problem that was very real is that early Adventist pastors and evangelists discovered here in the Dakotas, and I've discovered very quickly here as well, is it's very windy. And the wind sometimes could be your greatest enemy to having Adventist evangelistic tent meetings. And so if it got too windy, you would have to put your tent down, or sometimes you'd have a smaller tent. And one time, this is the story of it there, where they took the tent down, but even then the wind still ripped the tent apart from top to bottom. They had to patch it back up, but don't you worry, those Adventist evangelists could be very good seamsters, or whatever it's called, and they could sew that tent right back up, and they had the tent up and preaching away, preaching their hearts out the very next night. And so another one of these early churches, this is not too far from Swan Lake. This is where some of these early believers, so you get a little bit of an idea where some of these early groups were. Then we have the first Adventist camp meeting, 1879, also held in Sioux Falls. And guess who showed up as the keynote speakers? James and Ellen White. Did you know? Yeah, and my computer just died, so I knew I should have plugged it in. So all my little notes that I had on the side with the exact, but there's like a little island that's right near, and that's actually where the island was. James and Ellen White got by train as close as they could, but the last 35 miles they had to take a buggy. Where they had to and apparently it was a little bit rough, but when Ellen White finally got there, saw the site of the camp meeting, extolled how beautiful. This is one of the more beautiful camp meeting sites. She said it looked more like a resort area. It was so beautiful. And so they were preaching. People came out. Evangelistic meetings were held in conjunction. And you know what Ellen White preached about in her one and only camp meeting debut here in the Dakotas? All right, I'm going to put a pair of socks on the line for this one. Does anybody know what Ellen White preached about? Jesus. Well, she always preached about Jesus. Righteousness by faith? No. Come on, saints here. And she did. All right, my second pair of socks is for you. All right, don't let me forget afterwards. And she preached about temperance. the importance of temperance, because Ellen White liked to meet people where they were at and relevant topics. This is something a lot of people have questions about. If you can bring people to come in and be interested enough. And so she talked about a number of different kinds of things, but her big public thing where they invited all the people in the community in Sioux Falls to come was her special Sabbath afternoon lecture on temperance. And at the end of her lecture, she had the temperance pledge. They passed out the temperance pledge and this is an actual picture of one of those early temperance pledges here. So you imagine, you want to make a commitment. This makes a difference in your life, in the community. If people aren't drinking booze, it's better for your families. It's better economically. And when we pay attention to the health message, we make the prophet smile. Don't you like that? We know Ellen White, old photography, they had to sit there for a long time. So now we're using a little creative license again. But it's fun to imagine because we know she was a happy person. She was a vivacious person. And I'm sure, we know that she smiled a number of different times. So anyways, there's a picture. That's a postcard from turn of the century of Sioux Falls there with the earliest First Adventist camp meeting. And the other thing you do at camp meeting, in addition to having meetings and prayer and Bible study, they held the first conference constituency session where they elected officers and the first president of the conference, who is the same person I was just telling you about a couple slides ago. Let's see, where are we? Sorry, going all the way back here. Whitney, Seymour Whitney would become the first conference president. So there you go. Going right along here. There we go. And the railroad comes across about that time, right after the camp meeting, and they will have the transcontinental, the North Pacific Railroad will have their connecting. We have the one that's to the south, which is in Utah, where they have the Golden Spike, that they put together. Then they had the northern railway line that went through what we now know as North Dakota. They actually had four. They called them Golden Spike trains as well, and very soon a whole huge wave of immigration takes place. And there would be a number of people who would go across the northern Dakota plains and all along the railway in those little towns. The literature would spread, and there were little groups of people. Now, the First Adventist Church in North Dakota was organized in, anybody know? We have the new pastor of that church, Fargo. First church was organized in Fargo. One of our early church pastors here in the Dakota Conference was also the birth of youth ministry in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. His name was Luther Warren. As a young man, he had grown up in Michigan, moved westward, and he began organizing youth into what he called sunshine bands, that they would do daily work, missionary work for those that were around them. And so some of the earliest mission bands that we know of were organized here in the Dakotas and here in Mid-America. And the first school to organize mission bands on their campus was at Union. And so that strong heritage of missions is very much in the ethos and the very beginnings of Adventism here in Mid-America, but especially here in Dakota. So I love that about Luther Warren. You can imagine him and his friend as they stopped by the road one day after school, and they began to pray together, asking God to give them opportunities to be able to share their faith. And they began to get young people in their church together, organized into those sunshine or missionary bands. The other thing that's really interesting that happened here in the Dakotas, anybody recognize that name? Jasper Wayne Ingathering. Remember that back in the day? The ingathering, go around missionary. Yeah, so down in Iowa, northern Iowa, was a entrepreneur who owned a whole bunch of these different, he would sell fruit trees and different, all kinds. He had nurseries. And one of those nurseries that Jasper Wayne owned was just outside of Sioux Falls and Elk Point as well. And so he frequently would travel and sell his trees across the Dakota Plains to farmers that wanted a windbreak or whatever it is that they wanted. And so some of the earliest ingathering to take place in the birth of Adventism also took place here in the Dakotas. So kind of neat. He would get these, what he called clubs. That was a subscription of, I think it was about 50 or so issues, copies of the Review or Signs of the Times. He accidentally ordered too many. He was supposed to get one. He had multiple people at the Pacific Press fulfilled his order, so he got a whole big stack of them. His wife said, "What are you going to do with those? All of those subscriptions? You're going to have to pay for them." He said, maybe the Lord has a purpose in having those. And so he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share it with my friends and ask them to give an offering for the mission of the church. And that was the birth of Ingathering, which took place both in Iowa and in South Dakota. So kind of interesting that you here in the Dakotas, birthplace of a major source of financial nourishment of advancing the missionary work of the church around the world. So kind of neat. By the 1883 General Conference session, there were enough people in North Dakota that they made a resolution that we need to send a missionary to North Dakota. And so here we have a picture of that first missionary family. And Minnesota Conference will sponsor them. It'll actually be the Missionary Society of the Minnesota Conference, the Tract and Missionary Society, that will make this missionary endeavor. Not everyone is ready quite yet, so it takes almost a year before they send the first ones. But I'll try to read this off my slide. This is that first report. It says that it is almost impractical to work in the country, talking about North Dakota now, on account of the scattered conditions of the inhabitants. Some of you probably can recognize and appreciate that even today. You look across the plains, sometimes it's a little scattered, right? This is 1884. The farms are very large generally, and houses are far between. The winters are long and bleak. I guess he figured that out pretty quick. And the people are intensely bent on getting rich. But that God has a people here and a great work to be done, we have no shadow of doubt. Whatever the obstacles are, they may be overcome by the exercise of proper energy and the wisdom which comes from above. So that's 1884. I'll just tell you what I find in the archives, okay? But that becomes part of the impetus that we need to organize the work across the North Dakotas. And so December 4, 1884, G.C. Tenney and A.O. Olson, who, by the way, is a Scandinavian immigrant family, he'll become General Conference president, our first non-North American, because he is from Scandinavia, to be president of our world church. And his family will travel across the Dakotas and organize a whole series of different churches, and that will be becoming the beginnings of Adventism here across North Dakota. Well, for the sake of time, I want to make sure I wrap up and tell you that one of the more interesting discoveries I've found is that someone else who came to the Dakotas in the 1890s was Joshua V. Himes. Now, Himes is interesting to me because I think he's one of the coolest people in all of Adventist history. If you go back to the 1840s to William Miller, who's his sidekick, that is his publishing genius and creative genius that publishes, he creates charts and periodicals and millions of tracts. I mean, he was just a communications genius. One of his detractors called him the Napoleon of the press because he just was so effective at using communication to share his beliefs, the good news about Jesus and his soon return. So that's a picture of him as a young man. Now, after the whole great disappointment and people went different ways, some people gave up their faith, some went back and studied and became the founders of our church and discovered the Sabbath and the sanctuary and meaning out of the disappointment. Other people joined other groups of Adventists, and Himes was one of those that joined what would become known as the Advent Christian denomination. He was very active in that church for several decades until he met a man by the name of Miles Grant. Now, sometimes in the church, there's a thing we call church politics, because not everybody always gets along, and not everybody likes everybody. Or sometimes some people are jealous of people, and so in this case, Himes was the leader of the church. He was the president of their general conference, you might say. And Miles Grant came up with a plan. He says, I don't like Joshua Himes. I want to be president of the General Conference. And so one way of getting rid of your opponent is to start circulating malicious rumors about the person you don't like, that they are having affairs and doing all kinds of naughty, bad things. And so he started suggesting that there was some young women that he had been improper with and so on. And they were willing to testify. And it was sufficient enough that he lost his job. He got fired. And part of the reason we know this is those young ladies felt so guilty about it that they had been kind of put up to it. They later confessed of their role in this. But by the time they confessed, the damage had been done. It was too late. He was kind of disfellowshipped out of the church. So he went from president of their church to he was gone. And so he went through a deep existential crisis. Now, before he became an Adventist, and we're talking about Joshua Himes, he grew up in an Anglican home. And so when he lost his Adventist family, his Adventist church that he was a part of, he said, you know what, maybe I can go be a missionary. Maybe the Anglican church will take me back. And so he went to visit his bishop from his childhood, who was still alive. He went and visited him. And he said, well, you're an ordained minister, and how do you feel about your Adventist beliefs? So I still believe Jesus is coming. He said, well, as long as you don't talk about that too much, I think we could maybe make you an Episcopal Anglican priest. And so he went to the next big meeting of American Anglicans, the equivalent of their General Conference, and they blessed him and said, well, we need somebody to go be an Anglican priest on the Dakota Plains. And he said, sign me up. So here's Joshua Himes when most people would be retiring, and his wife by then had died. I mean, it's a long, sad story of some of those things. He said, well, I don't have anything to do other than, and so he comes to the Dakota Plains, starts doing evangelistic meetings. He holds temperance rallies, all kinds of interesting things. And this is a picture of him as an Anglican priest here in the Dakotas. And his home was in Elk Point, which we've talked about several other times. But his home would be there in Elk Point, but he would roam all across the Dakotas holding evangelistic meetings. And people said, you know, he's a very unusual Anglican priest because he likes to talk about Jesus coming again so much. But they liked him. He was very incarnational, loved the people, and they loved him back. Now, what's very interesting is there's this fun Adventist twist to this story because Joshua Himes got sick. He got cancer on his nose and on his face. And so he went to where all good people that have a medical crisis should go, to the #1 health facility in the world in the 1890s, the world famous Battle Creek Sanitarium. And so he went there and he said, you know, I remember there's an Ellen White, whatever happened to her? He said, well, she's a missionary in Australia right now. So while he is getting medical treatment at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, he said, what are you doing to support Ellen White? And so he's raising money among the patients to help support Ellen White's missionary work in Australia. You can't make this up. And so he collects a bunch of money, sends it to Ellen White with a letter telling her, and I'm using my Cliff Notes, Campbell Soup Note version summary of the letter correspondence back and forth. He basically says, I really admire the work you're doing. And at one point, it's this kind of wistful, you know, if I were to do it all over again, he wished that he had joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So he makes that wistful comment there to her, but they have this beautiful rekindling, this reconnection between him and Ellen White. Now, he will get those medical treatments, come back to Sioux Falls. Now, he lives a couple years longer. He will tragically pass away, and he's buried there in Sioux Falls. And I've gone to find his grave. That's a picture of his grave. And so Joshua Himes. So we have one of the more unusual Adventist heritage sites. Some of you that know me know that I like to find graves of early Adventist pioneers. So there you go. If any of you live or pass through Sioux Falls, you can stop in the cemetery, and the grave of Joshua Himes is there. And it was said of the Anglican priests that were buried, it was most unusual request because he wanted to face the side of the hill so he could be the first on resurrection morn to hear Gabriel's call at the resurrection when Jesus comes. And so there is this wonderful reminder of the birth of Adventism, one of the most significant Millerite pioneers of the Adventist Church. His remains are found here on the Dakota Plains there in Sioux Falls. So kind of a fun, interesting story. But I hope this has given you just a little bit of a taste of the story, the contributions, the sacrifice and commitment of these early peoples as they migrated. It wasn't an easy story, but but in the midst of the setbacks and trials that God was slowly working, and through literature, through preaching, through camp meetings, that we begin to see the heartbeat of Adventism as it took birth here on the Dakota Plains. So I hope that gives you a little inspiration and a little bit to, as you go back to wherever you live, to think about these early stories, these early pioneers. So let's pray, and I think I've got about 10 minutes maybe for just a couple questions, anything on my presentation or any of the other material. Happy to have any questions that you would like to ask. But let's pray together and ask God blessing as we wrap up our time. Father God, thank you so much for the privilege and opportunity of reflecting about how you've led in our past. We want to never forget. We want to remember because we know it's your leading through the lives of these very real people. And despite their foibles and flaws, that we can see your hand at work. And so we praise you, God, for how you have led in the past. But we also don't want to stay in the past. We also recognize you're calling us, just like those same pioneers, to finish the work that they began. So help us to be faithful to that sacred trust, to do the best within our ability to surrender to you each and every day, and to continue that legacy until that great and glorious day, Jesus. We believe with all our hearts you're coming soon. So help us to do with whatever we can within our sphere of influence to share that good news with others is my prayer in the loving name of Jesus. Amen. God bless you. Thank you for listening. We got maybe 10 minutes.